January 17th, 1945. Somewhere near the frozen Belgian border, the ground still trembled with the echoes of the Battle of the Bulge. Smoke hung low over a landscape of burnt-out Shermans and shattered pines. The snow was blackened with oil and ash. And yet, amid the wreckage, there was movement. In a clearing beside the road, American mechanics worked under the howl of distant artillery. Their gloves were stiff with frost, their faces gray from exhaustion. But they moved fast, too fast for what they were doing. A tank turret lay on its side like a giant's helmet, and somehow, impossibly, a crane truck was already lifting it back into place. A German prisoner, being marched past under guard, stopped to stare. He muttered something to himself in disbelief. Unmöglich. They're fixing it? To him, tanks destroyed in combat were gone forever. Yet here the Americans were, hammering, welding, refueling, turning wrecks into weapons again within hours. That moment captured something deeper than steel and skill. It revealed the secret rhythm of the U.S. Army's power, a machine that never truly stopped moving, even under fire. And behind that rhythm was an entire war industry brought to the front lines itself. By early 1945, the war in Europe had become a brutal test of endurance. The Allies had clawed their way across France after D-Day, fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, and now faced the final barrier before Germany itself, the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The German counteroffensive, launched in December 1944, had caught everyone by surprise. Tanks broke through fog and snow, American units were encircled, and entire roads became graveyards of steel. But beneath the chaos of battle, another story was unfolding, one that few noticed at the time, yet every commander depended on. It was the story of maintenance, logistics, and speed. The U.S. Army's armored divisions were not just fighting units, they were self-contained ecosystems. Behind every tank crew stood a small army of mechanics, welders, and recovery teams, men who never fired a shot, but decided whether battles were won or lost. Every destroyed tank was not a simple loss. It was a question: repair, replace, or abandon. And the American answer was always the same: repair and fast. This philosophy had been born long before the snow of Belgium. It began in 1940, when the United States, still at peace, was already preparing for a kind of war no one had yet fought. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department studied how Germany's Blitzkrieg campaigns relied on mobility, tanks that could move, strike, and move again. American planners realized that mobility didn't end at the front line. It extended into the repair yards, the depots, and the roads behind the fighting. By 1942, when U.S. forces landed in North Africa, the idea was already taking shape. Tank battalions brought along ordnance maintenance companies, specialized repair units equipped with cranes, welding trucks, spare engines, and entire portable workshops. They were called the tank doctors. Their job was simple: bring a tank back to life wherever it fell. At first, this idea met skepticism. Commanders doubted that repairs could be done under fire. Some preferred to wait for new tanks to arrive from depots hundreds of miles away. But in the deserts of Tunisia, delays meant death. Tanks bogged down in sand or hit by a single shell could not simply be left behind. Mechanics began improvising in the field, scavenging parts from wrecks, swapping engines between tanks, and working through the night under burning magnesium flares. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, this system had evolved into a masterpiece of wartime engineering. Each armored division now carried its own mobile repair battalion, complete with machine shops on wheels, forges, and cranes capable of lifting entire turrets. The moment a tank was hit, recovery crews rushed in with M32 or M31 recovery vehicles, towing the damaged machine back under cover. Within hours, welders were sealing armor plates, mechanics were fitting new tracks, and by morning, the tank often rolled back to the front. To German observers, this speed was incomprehensible. In the Wehrmacht, tank repair usually meant sending vehicles to rear depots, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. Replacement parts were scarce, transport fuel was limited, and every movement required authorization. A destroyed Panzer might be listed as in repair for weeks. The Americans, by contrast, treated a broken tank like a wounded soldier, to be patched up and sent back into battle immediately. That difference became critical during the winter of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge pushed U.S. logistics to the edge. Supply lines froze, engines failed, and snow buried everything under a white silence. Yet, somehow, American units kept fighting with near-intact strength. German prisoners often remarked that the same tanks they destroyed days earlier were back again, charging through the forests. To the U.S. command, this wasn't a miracle. It was the result of an invisible army of repairmen, truck drivers, and engineers who lived in mud and grease. They called their vehicles maintenance convoys, but they moved like frontline units. Every mile forward meant another risk, another chance to bring a tank back from the dead. And as the front lines shifted eastward, these men followed, carrying America's industrial muscle on their backs, from Normandy's hedgerows to the frozen rivers of the Rhine. It was a new kind of warfare, one where the line between factory and battlefield had all but vanished. The genius of America's wartime logistics wasn't just in its size, it was in its flexibility. The U.S. Army had learned that victory didn't depend only on producing tanks faster than the enemy, but on keeping them fighting longer. A Sherman might be lighter than a Panther or a Tiger, but if it could return to battle the next day, while the German machine lay rusting for weeks, the advantage was absolute. Behind this philosophy stood an extraordinary organization, the Ordnance Department's field maintenance system. By late 1944, this system had evolved into a layered chain that stretched from the combat zone all the way back to continental depots in England and beyond. At the very front were the company mechanics, men who could change tracks, fix minor leaks, or replace a machine gun mount in the mud. Behind them were battalion and division-level teams with welding trucks, cranes, and mobile machine shops. Further back still were the heavy maintenance companies, capable of full engine rebuilds or turret replacements. Every part had its place in this chain. The key was that each level knew exactly when to pass a tank down the line and when to push it back to the front. The result was a seamless flow of metal and manpower that turned breakdowns into brief interruptions, not permanent losses. But this system was only as good as the men running it. The U.S. Army's mechanics were often young. Many had been factory workers, truck drivers, or farmhands before the war. They weren't celebrated heroes. They didn't wear medals or appear in newspaper headlines. Yet they became the unseen backbone of the armored divisions. Working under freezing rain or blazing sun, they learned to perform miracles with minimal tools. Corporal Charles "Red" McDowell of the 3rd Armored Division once wrote home that he and his crew repaired more tanks than we can count, and everyone seems more broken than the last. They worked in ditches, behind barns, sometimes even inside ruined churches, anywhere they could find shelter. Their unit carried everything from blowtorches to spare engines, often stacked like puzzle pieces inside half-tracks. When fuel lines froze, they lit fires under the tanks. When engines seized, they rebuilt them on the spot. By the time the Allies crossed the German border in early 1945, This repair network was moving with the army itself, sometimes no more than a few miles behind the front. The 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions each maintained over 150,000 spare parts on the move, from tracks to pistons. Convoys of trucks marked Ordnance rolled day and night, linking combat units to depots like arteries feeding a giant body. German intelligence couldn't fully grasp how this worked. Reports from captured soldiers spoke of American tank hospitals near the front. Huge workshops that appeared overnight, complete with cranes, lathes, and supply tents. Luftwaffe pilots were ordered to target these installations, but they often disappeared before an airstrike could hit. The truth was simpler. The workshops were mobile. They were designed to pack up and move at a moment's notice. This mobility gave the U.S. Army an edge no enemy could match. A German Panzer division might lose half its tanks and be immobilized for weeks. An American armored division could suffer similar losses and be operational again within 24 hours. It wasn't just a matter of engineering. It was a matter of doctrine. General George S. Patton, who commanded the Third Army, understood this better than most. He once said, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men." Yet behind that line lay another truth. Those weapons must stay in the fight. Patton's staff worked relentlessly to keep repair units moving forward, even under enemy fire. His divisions used floating maintenance bases, leapfrogging repair companies closer to the front each day. The impact was dramatic. During the race across France in the summer of 1944, Patton's armored divisions advanced over 400 miles in less than a month, a pace unheard of in mechanized warfare. His tanks consumed parts faster than the supply chain could replace them. Yet his divisions rarely stopped. Mechanics scavenged, cannibalized, and improvised to keep the iron tide rolling east. By the time winter came and the German counteroffensive struck through the Ardennes, the Americans had perfected a kind of industrial resilience that no other army could match. Tanks that should have been abandoned were back in combat. Engines that should have frozen solid roared to life again. And as the snow thickened and the front lines bled into chaos, this invisible rhythm of men repairing, towing, refitting continued in the shadows. It was there, in the frozen forests of Belgium and the muddy roads of Luxembourg, that German commanders began to realize something extraordinary was happening on the other side of the line. To understand why the Germans were so astonished, one must look beyond the smoke and steel, at the different worlds the two armies lived in. The U.S. approach to war was not only technological, but deeply human, tactical, and industrial. Each of these angles revealed how a nation's mindset could transform the very nature of warfare. The human angle began with the American soldier himself, the ordinary mechanic, driver, or engineer who found himself at the edge of destruction, repairing machines while shells fell around him. They were men like Sergeant John "Lucky" Harlan of the 2nd Armored Division, who once worked 36 hours straight to get a Sherman back into combat after it had taken a direct hit through the glacis plate. "The tankers needed it more than I needed sleep," he later said. That simple, relentless sense of duty defined the repair crews. These were not soldiers of glory, but of grit. They lived in tents blackened by oil smoke, slept beside fuel drums, and carried wrenches instead of rifles. Yet, their courage was no less than those who charged into battle. Many died doing their job, crushed under collapsing hulls or caught in artillery strikes as they worked. The casualty rates among ordnance maintenance units were quietly high, though seldom mentioned. Their work demanded not only mechanical skill, but a level of calm under pressure that bordered on defiance. To the frontline tankers, these men were saviors. A knock on a tank's hull at dawn could mean a new engine, new tracks, or simply a second chance at survival. The relationship between crews and mechanics was intimate, almost sacred. A silent bond forged in oil and fear. Then there was the tactical angle, the way rapid repair reshaped how American units fought. Traditionally, a damaged tank meant a gap in the line, a hole in the formation. But U.S. commanders began to plan knowing that their armor could be replenished within hours. This changed everything. Armored thrusts could be more aggressive, more daring, because losses were temporary. For instance, during the fighting near Bastogne, tank battalions of the 4th Armored Division pushed through heavy German fire to reach the besieged paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. Dozens of Shermans were knocked out by hidden anti-tank guns. Yet, within 24 hours, many of those same tanks reappeared on the road, patched up by maintenance crews who had followed the assault. It wasn't luck. It was logistics turned into a weapon. The Germans noticed. Their own units, by contrast, were bound by a slower rhythm. When a panzer was hit, it often had to be recovered under cover of darkness, hauled by specialized vehicles that were themselves scarce. Spare parts were hoarded, engines rationed, and armor plates hard to replace. German tactical flexibility suffered, not from lack of skill, but from lack of repair speed. The technological angle lay in the design philosophy of American armor and supply. The M4 Sherman was often criticized for its thinner armor and less powerful gun compared to the German Tiger or Panther. But it carried a hidden advantage: simplicity. Every major component of the Sherman, from engine to suspension, could be swapped or repaired quickly in the field. Parts were standardized across thousands of vehicles. A mechanic from one division could fix a tank from another without hesitation. Contrast that with the Germans. The Tiger and Panther were engineering marvels, but over-engineered, each requiring precision parts and specialized tools. Their transmissions were fragile, their engines temperamental, and field repairs often impossible without factory support. A single broken final drive could sideline a tank indefinitely. This fundamental difference, simplicity versus sophistication, echoed America's broader wartime strategy. It wasn't about creating the perfect machine. It was about creating a machine that could survive imperfection. The U.S. Ordnance Department designed every component with maintenance in mind. Bolts were standardized, wiring simplified, and engines built to be replaced, not rebuilt. The tank recovery vehicles, like the M32 and M31, were equipped with cranes, winches, and torches that could strip or reassemble a tank in record time. Even the training manuals emphasized speed over perfection. Get it running was the rule, not make it flawless. As a result, American repair crews operated almost like field surgeons, cutting away damaged armor, replacing what they could, and sending the machine back to fight. It was a cycle of destruction and rebirth, repeated thousands of times across Europe. For the Germans watching from across the lines, it seemed almost supernatural, as if the Americans had an endless supply of tanks. What they didn't see was the organized chaos behind it. The long lines of trucks, the portable generators humming through the night, the glow of welding arcs painting the snow blue. It was here, in these hidden camps of light and noise, that the true power of the American war machine revealed itself. Not in the fire of battle, but in the quiet hum of repair. And for the German commanders trying to make sense of it, this was only the beginning of their disbelief. The next dimension was the leadership angle, the philosophy from the top that made this relentless repair culture possible. American generals, particularly George S. Patton and Omar Bradley, understood that speed was everything. They didn't just demand victory, they demanded movement. Patton once ordered, "Keep the tanks rolling." If one stops, fix it. If you can't fix it, use it for parts and fix another that wasn't bravado. It was Doctrine. Under his command, armored divisions developed a rhythm more akin to a machine than an army. Maintenance units weren't left behind, they advanced with the front. Patton insisted that every tank lost should be replaced. Not from rear depots, but from the very battlefield it fell upon. This aggressive maintenance mindset created a feedback loop. Crews pushed harder, knowing repairs were coming. Mechanics pushed faster, knowing the next offensive depended on them. In contrast, German command structures prized precision and control. Repair decisions traveled through a chain of paperwork, authorizations, and logistical bottlenecks. Even when a Panzer could be salvaged, it might sit for days waiting for permission or parts. By then, the battlefield had moved on. German generals like Heinz Guderian and Hasso von Manteuffel complained bitterly about this paralysis, not from cowardice, but from a system built for a short, lightning-fast war that had long since turned into an industrial siege. This brings us to the enemy perspective angle. What German officers actually thought when they witnessed American repair speed firsthand. After the war, several Wehrmacht commanders gave candid testimonies that revealed their astonishment. One Panzer officer captured during the Ardennes campaign recalled seeing a U.S. tank battalion he had shelled the day before suddenly reappear with the same vehicles. "We could not understand," he said, "how they could bring back to life what we had burned." Others reported similar experiences along the Siegfried Line. Major Hans von Luck, a veteran of the Panzer Lehr Division, later wrote in his memoirs that the Americans possessed the energy of a nation of mechanics. To him, it wasn't just the number of tanks. It was the tempo of their return. They fought as if their machines did not die, he noted. German intelligence officers even speculated that the Americans had forward factories hidden behind the lines. They weren't entirely wrong. In truth, American field depots functioned much like miniature factories, with assembly line systems for triage, disassembly, and repair. Each incoming tank was categorized. Category 1 for quick repair, Category 2 for major overhaul, Category 3 for scrap and parts. Nothing went to waste. Crews stripped wrecks to their frames, salvaging engines, gearboxes, and armor plates. The U.S. Army called it cannibalization, but to the Germans, it looked like sorcery. The final layer was the moral industrial angle, the deeper question of how a nation's psychology shaped its machines. America's wartime industry was built on abundance. The assembly lines of Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh had mastered the art of interchangeable production. Every tank, every jeep, every gun was part of a massive ecosystem that could be repaired with the same bolt, the same gasket, the same wrench. But more than that, there was a cultural difference at play. The American belief in fix it and go came from a society accustomed to machinery, tractors, automobiles, railroads. Every soldier understood the logic of engines and gears. When that mindset met military discipline, it produced something extraordinary. A combat repair culture that treated setbacks as temporary and destruction as reversible. For German soldiers, trained in precision and perfection, the idea of improvised repair seemed reckless. To Americans, it was second nature. A cracked armor plate, weld a patch, a jammed turret, use a crowbar and a prayer. The results weren't always elegant, but they worked. The American Army didn't need every tank to be flawless. It needed them to move, shoot, and survive the next 5 minutes. And in that difference lay the moral shock that rippled through German command. Their soldiers fought bravely, their tanks hit hard, but every loss was permanent. For the Americans, Losses were often temporary, a pause, not an ending. German officers, used to calculating attrition in exact figures, suddenly faced an enemy whose destroyed tanks didn't stay destroyed. In the frozen villages of Belgium and the forests of Western Germany, reports began to circulate among Wehrmacht units. The Americans bring their tanks back. It became a kind of grim joke among frontline troops, and a growing fear among their commanders. Every knocked-out Sherman might rise again by morning. That realization carried strategic weight. The German army had entered the Ardennes expecting to break American morale with shock and attrition. Instead, they found an opponent that simply refused to wear down. Every destroyed vehicle was replaced, repaired, or reborn. Every time the offensive seemed to gain ground, the same enemy formations reappeared, as relentless as the winter wind. This was no illusion. It was the visible result of a logistical philosophy that had fused American ingenuity with military necessity. And soon, as the war's final months unfolded, that philosophy would be tested in its most brutal form, under the collapsing skies of Western Germany, where the tank repair teams would face their greatest trial yet. March 1945. The Western Front was collapsing. German cities were burning, bridges blown, and the Rhine River, Hitler's last great defensive barrier, loomed before the Allied armies like a wall of steel and water. For months, the American advance had been grinding forward, sometimes inch by inch, sometimes in sweeping thrusts that tore through villages and forests. But every mile closer to the Rhine came at a terrible cost, in fuel, in men, and in tanks. By now, American armored divisions had worn themselves to the bone. The 3rd Armored Division alone had lost nearly half its tanks since the start of the winter. Engines overheated, transmissions cracked, tracks shattered on frozen ground. Even before enemy fire, mechanical exhaustion had become an enemy of its own. And yet, the U.S. armored spearheads kept moving. In early March, near the German town of Remagen, that relentless drive reached its decisive moment. The 9th Armored Division, advancing along the Rhine, stumbled upon something incredible. The Ludendorff Bridge still standing. The Germans had failed to demolish it in time. For the Americans, it was the opportunity of the war, a bridgehead straight into the heart of Germany. But as the first Sherman tanks began to cross, chaos erupted. German artillery zeroed in on the span. Bombs from the Luftwaffe rained down. The bridge shook under every explosion. Half the tanks attempting the crossing broke down or were damaged before they reached the far side. For any other army, that might have been the end. A pause, a retreat, a chance lost. For the Americans, it was a challenge. Within hours, Ordnance maintenance teams were working directly on the bridge approaches, repairing tanks even as shells burst around them. Welding sparks mixed with tracer fire in the air. Mechanics crawled beneath crippled tanks, replacing wheels and fuel lines by flashlight. Recovery vehicles shuttled constantly across the span, pulling wrecks out of the way to keep the column moving. A captain from the 9th Armored Division later wrote, "We were repairing them faster than the Germans could destroy them." That wasn't exaggeration. Every tank counted, and every minute saved meant another Sherman across the Rhine. By nightfall, hundreds had crossed. The bridge would eventually collapse from structural damage. But not before the Americans had established a strong bridgehead on the east bank. That moment, the crossing at Remagen, marked not only the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but the zenith of the American logistical machine. German commanders who studied the event later couldn't comprehend how so many damaged vehicles had reappeared in the fight so quickly. They had assumed that heavy losses at the bridge would cripple the offensive. Instead, within 24 hours, replacement and repaired tanks filled the gap. Behind the smoke and explosions, the ordnance system was performing a miracle of coordination. Recovery crews, known by their call signs as wrecker sections, were operating non-stop. Some worked up to 72 hours without rest. They dragged burnt-out Shermans from the mud, stripped usable parts, and installed them into others. A turret from one wreck might end up on another hull by morning. To maintain the bridgehead, American engineers built makeshift repair points right on the east bank. They used captured German workshops, barns, and even cellars. Spare parts came in on pontoon ferries and amphibious trucks. The constant clang of hammers and hiss of welders echoed through the fog. Mechanics worked under blackout conditions, guided only by small shielded lamps. And all the while, the German artillery kept firing. The ordnance crews worked in zones the infantry had not yet fully secured. When shells landed nearby, they simply dropped to the ground and waited for the ringing to fade before returning to their work. Their mission wasn't glory, it was continuity. If the tanks stopped, the bridgehead would die. Reports from the German 15th Army described the situation with disbelief. Enemy armored units appear replenished daily despite high destruction, one communiqué noted. They continue to advance with restored equipment at unnatural speed. To the Germans, it seemed as though the Americans were summoning tanks from thin air. But the truth was less mystical and more astonishing in its practicality. The U.S. Army had, by this point, mastered a logistical ballet so intricate that even chaos could not break it. Trucks carrying spare engines, transmissions, and even whole gun barrels were rolling behind the front like veins of a living organism. When a tank broke down, the replacement part was already en route before the report even reached headquarters. On the eastern side of the Rhine, the 9th and 3rd Armored Divisions pressed deeper into Germany. Villages fell one by one, resistance crumbled, and yet the tanks kept moving, patched, mended, and battle-scarred. Every one of them carried the marks of field repair, mismatched armor panels, improvised welds, scorched paint. They looked battered, but they moved with purpose. In those final weeks of the war, the Germans faced not only the might of American industry, but its mobility. A self-repairing army that refused to slow down. And as the Rhine bridgeheads expanded, that momentum became unstoppable. By late March 1945, the American armored divisions had crossed the Rhine in force. What followed was a pursuit so rapid that even their own generals struggled to keep up. In less than 3 weeks, the U.S. Third Army advanced nearly 200 miles into the heart of Germany, capturing towns faster than maps could be updated. But this advance came at a price. A constant mechanical toll that would have shattered any other army's mobility. Roads were clogged with tanks, half-tracks, and convoys of supply trucks. Engines overheated, suspensions collapsed under the relentless strain. Fuel pumps burned out, transmissions cracked from overuse. Yet, despite it all, the armor never stopped rolling. Every time a column halted, repair teams seemed to materialize out of the landscape, crawling from ditches, emerging from the backs of trucks already at work before the dust settled. This was the unseen war, the one fought not in gunfire, but in grease and grit. A tank that should have taken weeks to rebuild in a factory was back in action within a day. Crews joked that they could destroy the same Sherman twice in 1 week and still see it fighting by the weekend. In the towns of Limburg, Fulda, and Gießen, the Germans who surrendered often found American repair depots operating right next to the front lines. Machine shops ran 24 hours a day, powered by generators humming through the night. Cranes lifted turrets under the glow of lanterns. Mechanics used captured German tools, spare armor plates from wrecked panzers, and even cannibalized enemy vehicles to keep their own machines alive. One German officer, captured near Kassel, asked his American interrogator how many tanks the U.S. had brought across the Rhine. The officer was told, "More than enough." What he didn't realize was that many of those tanks had already been destroyed. Once, twice, sometimes 3 times. The Americans weren't just fighting. They were recycling war itself. By now, the system had reached full efficiency. Every armored division had its own maintenance island, a temporary base that moved forward every few days. When the division advanced, the base followed like a shadow. These repair islands included mobile cranes, engine depots, spare part trucks, and field forges. Within hours of establishing a new position, they could be operational. It was a traveling factory line, Detroit on wheels. The men who ran it barely slept. In one report from the 4th Armored Division, Ordnance units averaged 90 hours of labor per week. Some mechanics kept count of how many tanks they had resurrected, marking small white stars on the sides of their trucks. Their pride was quiet, their exhaustion immense. Yet, morale remained unbroken. They knew their work meant survival for thousands. German commanders began noticing the difference in tempo. While their own armored formations dwindled daily from mechanical attrition, American divisions seemed immune to fatigue. The speed of the U.S. advance created a psychological shock across the Wehrmacht's high command. General Walter Wenck, commanding the German 12th Army, described the American advance as a steel tide that repaired itself as it moved. At this point, even Hitler's generals were running out of explanations. Intelligence reports spoke of American replacement magic, assuming massive reinforcements were arriving daily from France. In truth, the reinforcements were already there, in the form of resurrected tanks, repaired weapons, and refurbished vehicles that simply refused to die. This phenomenon reached its peak in early April during the encirclement of the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. As Allied forces trapped over 300,000 German troops inside the pocket, the battle turned into a logistical nightmare. Mud, destroyed bridges, and constant artillery fire tore through American supply columns. Tanks broke down by the dozens. Yet, day after day, the armored spearheads reassembled themselves. When the 3rd Armored Division reached Paderborn, they reported more operational tanks than they had a week earlier, despite continuous combat. The explanation was staggering. Their Ordnance battalion had repaired 87 vehicles in just 5 days, often reusing parts from German wrecks. Captured panzer tracks and armor plates were welded onto Shermans, giving them a bizarre, patchwork appearance that made them instantly recognizable. The men joked that these Frankenstein tanks were tougher than the originals. In the chaos of that final push, something remarkable happened. The battlefield itself became a factory. The U.S. Army had blurred the line between combat and production so completely that they no longer depended on distant industry to keep fighting. They carried it with them. To the Germans, it was the ultimate shock. They had spent years believing their technological superiority could compensate for dwindling numbers. But as April unfolded, they faced an enemy that could destroy, repair, and return to battle faster than they could react. Their elite tank divisions, once the pride of the Reich, were crumbling not just from enemy fire, but from exhaustion and obsolescence. In one intercepted message near Hanover, a German colonel wrote bitterly, "The Americans fight with machines that rise again. We destroy them, and they return. There is no end." That single sentence captured the essence of the turning point. It wasn't just about the fall of cities or the capture of bridges. It was about the collapse of belief. The realization that Germany's war machine had met something more powerful than tanks or guns, a system that refused to stop working. As April turned to May and the American columns rolled unbroken toward the Elbe River, the German army could only watch the inevitable unfold, their world disintegrating under the weight of an enemy that seemed to never run out of life, steel, or will. And when the final shots were fired, what remained was not just victory, but proof that the true battlefield of the Second World War had been as much mechanical as it was human. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a graveyard of machines. Burnt-out tanks lined the roads from Cologne to Magdeburg, silent witnesses to a war fought as much with wrenches as with rifles. Yet among the wreckage, one army stood apart, its vehicles still rumbling, its supply lines still pulsing with motion. The U.S. Army, through its mastery of repair and logistics, had ended the war stronger than it had begun. In the days following Germany's surrender, Allied survey teams began inspecting the battlefields. What they discovered stunned even veteran officers. Many American tanks had fought through 4 or 5 major engagements without ever being replaced. Entire units reported that over 70% of their armor had been rebuilt at least once in the field. The scale of this endurance was unprecedented in modern warfare. The numbers told a story of quiet genius. Between the Normandy landings and VE Day, U.S. Ordnance maintenance units had repaired over 650,000 vehicles and 12,000 tanks. The equivalent of replacing every armored vehicle in the European theater twice over. In comparison, the German Panzerwaffe could replace only a fraction of its losses, crippled by Allied bombing and resource collapse. What had once been a contest of steel had turned into a war of systems, and America's system had proven invincible. Captured German officers gave their own accounts. General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of the Wehrmacht's most respected tank commanders, later admitted, "Our tanks were superior, our gunners well-trained. But the Americans had something else, a machine that never slept. You could destroy their tanks, but not their ability to keep fighting." This realization hit home as Allied forces occupied the ruins of Germany's industrial heartland, in Essen, Dortmund, and Düsseldorf. Cities that had once produced the might of the Panzer divisions, American engineers now inspected abandoned factories. They noted how fragile the German production chain truly was. A single bombing raid could halt an entire tank line for weeks. In contrast, U.S. field workshops had proven almost immune to disruption. Mobility had replaced vulnerability. The mobile repair miracle, as some officers began calling it, became a blueprint for post-war military doctrine. Reports circulated throughout the War Department emphasizing that flexibility, not just firepower, had won the war. The success of the American ordnance and maintenance units directly influenced the structure of future armored divisions. Every mechanized force, it was decided, would carry its own industry within it. In France and Belgium, civilians who had witnessed the American advance recalled the sound of tanks being repaired at night. The hiss of torches, the clang of steel, the rhythm of hammers echoing through ruined towns. They called it the night work of victory. For the men who had lived it, the aftermath was quieter, but not without scars. Many mechanics returned home with shattered hearing, burns, and chronic fatigue. They had worked under fire, often within earshot of enemy guns. But their pride was immense. They knew they had been part of something extraordinary. In interviews conducted years later, some of them described the same feeling, not of heroism, but of purpose. One veteran from the 3rd Armored Division put it simply, "Every tank I fixed meant 5 men went home alive. That was enough for me. Even as Germany lay defeated, the lessons of its downfall were clear to every military observer. The Reich had bet everything on superior design and advanced weaponry. The Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger. But each one was a masterpiece that could not be replaced fast enough, repaired easily enough, or maintained affordably enough to survive the storm. The Americans, by contrast, had built a war machine that valued practicality over perfection. Their tanks might not have been the strongest, but they were the ones still moving when it mattered most. In the ruins of Kassel, a German tank yard once dedicated to the Panzer IVs now held lines of captured Shermans and Pershings. Many of them bore weld scars and mismatched armor panels, physical proof of the U.S. Army's battlefield improvisation. Mechanics walking through the yard recognized their own handiwork. They didn't see wrecks, they saw survivors. And as they looked across that landscape of twisted metal, they understood what had truly won the war. Not just courage or numbers or even technology, but the relentless ability to rebuild, to recover, and to keep moving forward no matter what broke down. That spirit, born in the mud of France and the smoke of the Ardennes, would not end with the war. It would carry into the next century, shaping how America would fight and how the world would measure power. In the months following Germany's surrender, the Allies turned from war fighting to understanding, documenting every system, every success, every failure. Among the endless reports pouring into the U.S. War Department, one subject kept reappearing: the extraordinary performance of the American Field Maintenance Corps. Their work had been so effective, so invisible, that even senior commanders were only beginning to grasp its full scale. Across Europe, Ordnance officers compiled data from frontline units. The findings were astonishing. In many divisions, less than 10% of all mechanical casualties had resulted in total write-offs. Nearly every tank or vehicle was recovered, repaired, and returned to service, often within 48 hours. Some divisional reports claimed that 80% of tanks knocked out in combat had re-entered the line within a week. It was a logistical miracle built on sweat, discipline, and an almost industrial creativity. Generals touring the ruined front lines found entire depots still running as if the war hadn't ended. In one former repair yard near Koblenz, American mechanics were still at work dismantling engines, sorting parts, and refurbishing captured German vehicles, preparing them for use in the occupation forces. Even in peace, their instinct was to keep the machines alive. Back in Washington, military analysts drew comparisons to the German and Soviet systems. The Wehrmacht had been brilliant in tactics, but brittle in structure. Its armored divisions relied heavily on rail transport and central depots, both of which were easily destroyed by Allied bombers. Once a tank broke down far from supply, it was often abandoned and lost forever. In contrast, the Americans had carried their industry into the field, a concept that would redefine modern warfare. The Army's Ordnance Department began drafting new doctrines based on what they called forward maintenance philosophy, or every combat unit, they concluded, must have its own mobile repair capability, capable of independent operation for weeks. This idea would later shape the foundation of U.S. military logistics through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, ensuring that the lessons learned in Europe would never be forgotten. German engineers who inspected American equipment after the war were equally astonished. They marveled not at the complexity of the U.S. machines, but at their simplicity. The Sherman's modular design, the standardization of parts, and the interchangeability between models had made rapid repair possible. It was engineering built not for brilliance, but for endurance. A former German tank designer from the Henschel Works put it bluntly: "We built machines that could win battles. The Americans built machines that could win wars. That distinction would echo through the decades to come. Even in the first months of occupation, American repair crews continued their work, restoring bridges, clearing wrecks, and even teaching German civilians how to maintain Allied vehicles used for reconstruction. In a strange twist of fate, the same men who had once kept tanks alive for battle were now keeping trucks alive for rebuilding Europe. For many of them, demobilization brought a difficult transition. After years of constant motion, engines roaring, torches blazing, deadlines measured in lives, peace felt unnervingly quiet. Some returned to Detroit, Buffalo, and Cleveland, bringing with them new ideas that would revolutionize post-war manufacturing. The same efficiency that had rebuilt tanks in hours would soon help rebuild America's economy. By 1946, historians and military strategists had begun to label the American repair system as one of the silent weapons of victory. A logistical backbone that had turned the tide more decisively than any single weapon or general. It proved that in modern warfare, victory belongs not only to those who can fight, but to those who can sustain the fight. When veterans of the Ordnance units gathered years later at reunions, they spoke little of glory. Instead, they remembered the smell of oil, the cold metal under their hands, the constant hum of machinery in the dark. They remembered the faces of tank crews who came back to thank them, alive because a machine had been made whole again. For them, the war had not been about destruction. It had been about restoration, about defying the chaos of battle by rebuilding order from ruin. And as they looked back on the long roads of Europe, littered with the ghosts of steel and fire, they knew one truth with quiet certainty. The armies that endure are the ones that know how to repair themselves. When the smoke of war cleared and the machines fell silent, the true legacy of America's armored power wasn't written in the number of tanks produced, but in the ones rebuilt, revived, and returned. The story of U.S. battlefield repair was never one of glory or spectacle. It was a story of persistence, of men who refused to let exhaustion, mud, or metal defeat them. Every wrench turned in the cold, every torch lit in the dark, carried the same message. War could destroy, but it could not stop the will to rebuild. In that sense, the maintenance crews of World War II embodied something far larger than victory. They represented a philosophy that strength is not in what never breaks, but in what can always be repaired. Their work proved that warfare had changed forever. No longer would armies depend solely on the factories back home or the shipments across the ocean. The battlefield itself had become an ecosystem, one capable of self-repair, adaptation, and survival under the harshest conditions. The front line had fused with the production line. Historians would later call it the mechanical miracle of the Western Front. But to the men who lived it, it was simply necessity. The quiet determination to keep moving forward when everything else seemed to be falling apart. It was not the roar of engines or the thunder of guns that defined victory, but the steady rhythm of hammers in the night. In the ruins of Europe, as nations rebuilt from the ashes, the lesson endured. Power was no longer measured by who could strike hardest, but by who could recover fastest. And on that front, the United States had proven unmatched. Long after the last tank was scrapped and the last field shop dismantled, the legacy of those mechanics and engineers lived on. In every armored column that crossed a desert, every convoy that rolled through a jungle, every modern army that learned the same unshakable truth: that endurance wins wars, not perfection. For every machine reborn beneath their hands, they left behind a message written in oil and steel that resilience is victory's truest form, and that even in the darkest hours of war, rebuilding is its most human act.